Hey everybody, I'm Jason Kishinev. Welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about half an hour of history together. Remember, if you like what you hear in this episode, hit that like and subscribe button and that notification bell. Let's dig in. Wendell Phillips, with all his criticism of Lincoln, recognized the possibilities in his election. Speaking at the Tremont Temple in Boston the day after the election, Phillips said, "If the Telegraph speaks truth, for the first time in our history, the slave has chosen a president of the United States. Not an abolitionist, hardly an anti-slavery man. Mr. Lincoln consents to represent an anti-slavery idea. A pawn on the political chessboard, his value is in his position. With fair effort, we may soon change him for knight, bishop, or queen and sweep the board." Conservatives in the Boston upper classes wanted conciliation with the South. At one point, they stormed an abolitionist meeting at that same Tremont Temple shortly after Lincoln's election and asked that concessions be made to the South in the interests of commerce, manufacturers, agriculture. The spirit of Congress, even after the war began, was shown in a resolution it passed in the summer of 1861, with only a few dissenting votes. This war is not waged for any purpose of overthrowing or interfering with the rights of established institutions of those states, but to preserve the Union. The abolitionists stepped up their campaign. Emancipation petitions poured into Congress in 1861 and 1862. In May of that year, Wendell Phillips said, "Abraham Lincoln may not wish it, he cannot prevent it. The nation may not will it, but the nation cannot prevent it. I do not care what men want or wish. The Negro is the pebble in the cogwheel, and the machine cannot go on until you get him out." In July, Congress passed a Confiscation Act, which enabled the freeing of slaves of those fighting the Union. But this was not enforced by the Union generals, and Lincoln ignored the non-enforcement. Garrison, that is, they were freeing the slaves of Confederate soldiers. Garrison called Lincoln's policy stumbling, halting, prevaricating, irresolute, weak, besotted, and Phillips said Lincoln was a first-rate, second-rate man. An exchange of letters between Lincoln and Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, in August of 1862, gave Lincoln a chance to express his views. Greeley wrote, "Dear Sir, I do not intrude to tell you, for you must know already, that a great proportion of those who triumphed in your election are sorely disappointed and deeply pained by the policy you seem to be pursuing with regard to the slaves of rebels. We require of you, as the first servant of the Republic, charged especially and preeminently with this duty, that you execute the laws," in all caps. You think in 1862, all caps was considered shouting? "We think you are strangely and disastrously remiss with regard to the emancipating provisions of the new Confiscation Act. We think you are unduly influenced by the counsels of certain politicians hailing from the border slave states. Greeley appealed to the practical need of winning the war. We must have scouts, guides, spies, cooks, teamsters, diggers, and choppers from the blacks of the South, whether we allow them to fight for us or not. I entreat you to render a hearty and unequivocal obedience to the law of the land. Lincoln had already shown his attitude by his failure to countermand an order of one of his commanders, General Henry Halleck, who forbade fugitive Negroes to enter his army's lines. Now he replied to Greeley, "Dear sir, I have not meant to leave anyone in doubt. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could do it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because it helps to save this Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. Yours, A. Lincoln." So Lincoln distinguished between his personal wish and his official duty. When in September 1862, Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, it was a military move, giving the South 4 months to stop rebelling, threatening to emancipate their slaves if they continued to fight, promising to leave slavery untouched in states that came over to the North. That on this first day of January A.D. 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Thus, when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, January 1st, 1863, almost 2 years into the war, it declared slaves free in those areas still fighting against the Union, which it listed very carefully, and said nothing about slaves behind Union lines. As Hofstadter put it, the Emancipation Proclamation had all the moral grandeur of a bill of lading. The London Speculator wrote concisely, "The principle is not that a human being cannot justly own another, but that he cannot own him unless he is loyal to the United States." Limited as it was, the Emancipation Proclamation spurred anti-slavery forces. By the summer of 1864, 400,000 signatures asking legislation to end slavery had been gathered and sent to Congress, something unprecedented in the history of the country. That April, the Senate had adopted the 13th Amendment, declaring an end to slavery, and in January 1865, the House of Representatives followed. With the proclamation, the Union Army was open to blacks, and the more blacks entered the war, the more it appeared a war for their liberation. The more whites had to sacrifice, the more resentment there was, particularly among poor whites in the North, who were drafted by a law that allowed the rich to buy their way out of the draft for $300. And so the draft riots of 1863 took place. Uprisings of angry whites in northern cities, their targets not the rich far away, but the blacks near at hand. It was an orgy of death and violence. A black man in Detroit described what he saw: a mob with kegs of beer on wagons, armed with clubs and bricks, marching through the city, attacking black men, women, children. He heard one man say, "If we are got to be killed up for Negroes, then we will kill everyone in this town." The Civil War was one of the bloodiest in human history up to that time. 600,000 dead on both sides, in a population of 30 million. The equivalent in the United States of 1978, with the population of 250 million, of 5 million dead. proportional population-wise. As the battles became more intense, as the bodies piled up, as war fatigue grew, the existence of blacks in the South, 4 million of them, became more and more a hindrance to the South and more an opportunity for the North. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction pointed this out. These slaves had enormous power in their hands. Simply by stopping work, they could threaten the Confederacy with starvation. By walking into the federal camps, they showed to doubting Northerners the easy possibility of using them thus, but by the same gesture, depriving their enemies of the use in just these fields. It was this plain alternative that brought Lee's sudden surrender. Either the South must make terms with its slaves, free them, use them to fight the North, and thereafter no longer treat them as bondsmen, or they could surrender to the North with the assumption that the North after the war must help them to defend slavery as it had before. George Rawick, a sociologist and anthropologist, describes the developments of blacks up to and into the Civil War. The slaves went from being frightened human beings thrown among strange men, including fellow slaves who were not their kinsmen and who did not speak their language or understand their customs and habits, to what W.E.B. Du Bois once described as the general strike, whereby hundreds of thousands of slaves deserted the plantations, destroying the South's ability to supply its army. Black women played an important part in the war, especially toward the end. Sojourner Truth, the legendary ex-slave who had been active in the women's rights movement, became recruiter of black troops for the Union Army, as did Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin of Boston. Harriet Tubman raided plantations, leading black and white troops, and in one expedition freed 750 slaves. Women moved with the colored regiments that grew as the Union Army marched through the South, helping their husbands, enduring terrible hardships on the long military treks in which many children died. They suffered the fate of soldiers, as in April 1864 when Confederate troops at Fort Pillow, Kentucky, massacred Union soldiers who had surrendered, black and white, along with women and children in an adjoining camp. It has been said that black acceptance of slavery is proved by the fact that during the Civil War, when there were opportunities for escape, most slaves stayed on the plantation. In fact, 500,000 ran away, about 1 in 5, a high proportion when one considers that there was great difficulty in knowing where to go or how to live. The owner of a large plantation in South Carolina and Georgia wrote in 1862, "This war has taught us the perfect impossibility of placing the least confidence in the Negro. In too numerous instances, that's two T-O-O, in too numerous instances those we esteem the most have been the first to desert us." That same year, a lieutenant in the Confederate Army and once mayor of Savannah, Georgia, wrote, "I deeply regret to learn that the Negroes still continue to desert to the enemy." A minister in Mississippi wrote in the fall of 1862, "On my arrival, was surprised to hear that our Negroes stampeded to the Yankees last night, or rather a portion of them. I think every one, but with 1 or 2 exceptions, will go to the Yankees. Eliza and her family are certain to go. She does not conceal her thoughts, but plainly manifests her opinions by her conduct, insolent and insulting." And a women's plantation journal of January 1865. The people are all idle on the plantations, most of them seeking their own pleasure. Many servants have proven faithful, others false and rebellious against all authority and restraint. Their condition is one of perfect anarchy and rebellion. They have placed themselves in perfect antagonism to their owners and to all government and control. Nearly all the house servants have left their homes, and from most of the plantations they have gone in a body, together. Also in 1865, a South Carolina planter wrote to the New York Tribune that the conduct of the Negro in the late crisis of our affairs has convinced me that we were all laboring under a delusion. I believed that these people were content, happy, and attached to their masters, but events and reflection have caused me to change these positions. If they were content, happy, and attached to their masters, then why did they desert him in the moment of his need and flock to an enemy whom they did not know, and thus left their perhaps really good masters whom they did know from infancy? Really good masters. It's very thick-headed. Genovese notes that the war produced no general uprising of slaves, but in Lafayette County, Mississippi, slaves responded to the Emancipation Proclamation by driving off their overseers and dividing the land and implements among themselves. Aptheker reports a conspiracy of Negroes in Arkansas in 1861 to kill their enslavers. In Kentucky that year, houses and barns were burned by Negroes, and in the city of Newcastle, slaves paraded through the city, singing political songs and shouting for Lincoln, according to newspaper accounts. After the Emancipation Proclamation, a Negro waiter in Richmond, Virginia, was arrested for leaving a servile plot. While in Yazoo City, Mississippi, slaves burned the courthouse and 14 homes. There were special moments. Robert Smalls, later a South Carolina congressman, and other blacks took over a steamship, the Planter, and sailed it past the Confederate guns to deliver it to the Union Army. Most slaves neither submitted nor rebelled. They continued to work, waiting to see what happened. When opportunity came, they left, often joining the Union Army. 200,000 blacks were in the Army and Navy, and 38,000 were killed. Historian James McPherson says, "Without their help, the North could not have won the war as soon as it did, and perhaps it could not have won at all." What happened to blacks in the Union Army and in the northern cities during the war gave some hint of how limited the emancipation would be, even with full victory over the Confederacy. Off-duty black soldiers were attacked in northern cities, as in Zanesville, Ohio, in February 1864, where cries were heard to kill the N-word. Black soldiers were used for the heaviest and dirtiest work, digging trenches, hauling logs and cannon, loading ammunition, digging wells for white regiments. White privates received $13 a month. Negro privates received $10 a month. Late in the war, a black sergeant of the 3rd South Carolina Volunteers, William Walker, marched his company to his captain's tent and ordered them to stack arms and resign from the army as a protest against what he considered a breach of contract because of unequal pay. He was court-martialed and shot for mutiny. Finally, in June 1864, Congress passed a law granting equal pay to Negro soldiers. The Confederacy was desperate in the latter part of the war, and some of its leaders suggested the slaves, more and more an obstacle to their cause, be enlisted, used, and freed. After a number of military defeats, the Confederate Secretary of War, Judah Benjamin, wrote in late 1864 to a newspaper editor in Charleston, It is well known that General Lee, who commands so largely the confidence of the people, is strongly in favor of our using the Negroes for defense and emancipating them if necessary for that purpose. One general, indignant, wrote, "If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." By early 1865, the pressure had mounted, and in March, President Davis of the Confederacy signed a Negro Soldier Law, authorizing the enlistment of slaves as soldiers to be freed by consent of their owners and their state governments. But before it had any significant effect, the war was over. Excuse me. Former slaves interviewed by the Federal Writers Project in the 30s recalled the war's end. Susie Melton. This is a Susie Melton quote. It's so weird how he does this. He just says Susie Melton. "I was a young gal about 10 years old, and we done heard that Lincoln gonna turn the N-words free. Old missus say there wasn't nothing to it. Then a Yankee soldier told someone in Williamsburg that Lincoln done signs of emancipation. Was winter time and mighty cold that night, but everybody commenced getting ready to leave. Didn't care nothing about missus. Was going to the Union lines, and all that night the N-words danced and sang right out in the cold. Next morning at daybreak, we all started out with blankets and clothes and pots and pans and chickens piled on our backs, 'cause missus said we couldn't take no horses or carts. And as the sun come up over the trees, the N-words started to singing." Wow, there's a song. "Son, you be here and I'll be gone. Son, you be here and I'll be gone. Son, you be here and I'll be gone. Bye bye, don't grieve after me. Why won't you give my place, not for yours? Bye bye, don't grieve after me. 'Cause you be here and I'll be gone." Sorry, that sucked. Anna Woods. That'd be better if I had some kind of melody. Anna Woods said, "We wasn't there in Texas long when the soldiers marched in to tell us that we were free. I remembers one woman, she jumped on a barrel and she shouted. She jumped off and she shouted. She jumped back on again and shouted some more. She kept that up for a long time, just jumping on a barrel and back off again." Annie Mae Weathers said, "I remember hearing my pa say that when somebody came and hollered, 'You N-words is free at last,' say he just dropped his hoe and said in a queer voice, 'Thank God for that.'" The Federal Writers Project recorded an ex-slave named Fanny Berry. N-words shouting and clapping hands and singing, chillin', running all over the place, beating time and yelling. Everybody happy. Show did some celebrating. Run to the kitchen and shout in the window, "Mammy, don't you cook no more. You's free. You's free." Many Negroes understood that their status after the war, whatever their situation legally, would depend on whether they owned the land they worked on or would be forced to be semi-slaves for others. In 1863, a North Carolina Negro wrote that if the strict law of right and justice is to be observed, the country around me is the entailed inheritance of the Americans of African descent, purchased by the invaluable labor of our ancestors through a life of tears and groans, under the lash and yoke of tyranny. Abandoned plantations, however, were leased to former planters and to white men of the North. As one colored newspaper said, "The slaves were made serfs and chained to the soil. Such was the boasted freedom acquired by the colored man at the hands of the Yankee. Under congressional policy approved by Lincoln, the property confiscated during the war under the Confiscation Act of July 1862 would revert to the heirs of the Confederacy owners. I'm going to read that again. Under congressional policy approved by Lincoln, the property confiscated during the war under the Confiscation Act of July 1862, which was the slaves of rebels, would revert to the heirs of the Confederate owners. Dr. John Rock, a black physician in Boston, spoke at a meeting. Why talk about compensating masters? Compensate them for what? What do you owe them? What does the slave owe them? What does society owe them? Compensate the master? It is the slave who ought to be compensated. The property of the South is by right the property of the slave. Some land was expropriated on grounds the taxes were delinquent and sold at auction. But only a few blacks could afford to buy this. In the South Carolina Sea Islands, out of 16,000 acres up for sale in March of 1863, freedmen who pooled their money were able to buy 2,000 acres, the rest being bought by northern investors and speculators. A freedman on the islands dictated a letter to a former teacher, now in Philadelphia. My dear young missus, do, my missus, tell Lincoln that we wants land. This very land that is rich with the sweat of the face and the blood of we back. We can buy a bin, buy all we want, but they make the lots too big and cut we out. The word come from Mass Lincoln's self that we take out claims and hold on to 'em and plant 'em, and we will see that we get 'em, every man 10 or 20 acre. We too glad. We stake out and list, but for the time for plant, these commissionaries sells to white folks all the best land. Where Lincoln? In early 1865, General William T. Sherman held a conference in Savannah, Georgia, with 20 Negro ministers and church officials, mostly former slaves, at which one of them expressed their need. The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land and till it by our labor. 4 days later, Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15, designating the entire southern coastline 30 miles inland for exclusive Negro settlement. Freedmen could settle there, taking no more than 40 acres per family. By June 1865, 40,000 freedmen had moved on to new farms in this area, but President Andrew Johnson in August of 1865 restored this land to the Confederate owners, and the freedmen were forced off, some at bayonet point. Ex-slave Thomas Hall told the Federal Writers Project, Lincoln got the praise for freeing us, but did he do it? He gave us freedom without giving us any chance to live to ourselves, and we still had to depend on the Southern white man for work, food, and clothing, and he held us out of necessity and want in a state of servitude but little better than slavery. The American government had set out to fight the slave states in 1861, not to end slavery, but to retain the enormous national territory and market and resources. Yet victory required a crusade. And the momentum of that crusade brought new forces into national politics. More blacks determined to make their freedom mean something. More whites, whether freedmen's bureaus officials or teachers in the Sea Islands or carpetbaggers, with various mixtures of humanitarianism and personal ambition concerned with racial equality. There was also the powerful interest of the Republican Party in maintaining control over the national government. With the prospect of Southern black votes to accomplish this. Northern businessmen, seeing Republican policies as beneficial to them, went along for a while. The result was that brief period after the Civil War in which Southern Negroes voted, elected blacks to state legislatures and to Congress, introduced free and racially mixed public education to the South. A legal framework was constructed. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The 14th Amendment repudiated the pre-war Dred Scott decision by declaring that all persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens. It also seemed to make a powerful statement for racial equality, severely limiting states' rights. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or the pursuit or property, not the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, or property, without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The 15th Amendment said, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Congress passed a number of laws in the late 1860s and early 1870s in the same spirit. Laws making it a crime to deprive Negroes of their rights, requiring federal officials to enforce those rights, giving Negroes the right to enter contracts and buy property without discrimination. And in 1875, a Civil Rights Act outlawed the exclusion of Negroes from hotels, theaters, railroads, and other public accommodations. Let's end there, shall we? Thanks for joining me. Hope you tune into the next episode. Hope you hit that like and subscribe button. Thank you.